Welcome to today's webinar, the European Commission's proposals to simplify CBAM and reduce administrative burden on importers. We have a few housekeeping items to cover before we get started. If you experience any technical difficulties with the WebEx session, please send a message via the Q&A panel asking for assistance. Select Host and press Send. This will be picked up by our IT support colleague. As a reminder, this event is being recorded, and during the presentation, all participants will remain in listen-only mode. We will be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. We encourage you to submit written questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A panel, which is located in the lower right of your screen. Please type your questions into the text field, select the drop-down as All Panelists, and press Send. I will now hand over to Thomas Delisle, who will begin the presentation.
Thank you very much, Holly. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you today for the second webinar of a series of webinars on the recent proposals made by the European Union to simplify its regulatory framework on sustainability-led legislations under the so-called omnibus proposals. I'm here today with my colleague Valerio Giovannini and partnering with Simon Goss from Carbonir. Carbonir is a Berlin-based consulting company with expertise in the areas of CO2 markets, CBAM decarbonization, and climate neutrality. Carbonir accompanies manufacturing companies, service providers, and other organizations in integrating these multifaceted topics into existing processes. With me today, Simon Goss, Managing Director. He is an energy engineer and expert on energy and carbon markets. As said, Managing Director at Carbonir. He led international consultancy projects, studies, and more than 200 workshops on energy and carbon markets, trading, and policy. As a legal and regulatory expert, Valerio Giovannini, a lawyer in our public policy practice of Squire Patton Boggs, Brussels office. He advises clients on a wide range of regulatory and compliance matters under EU law, with a focus on environmental and emissions-related legislation. Valerio has extensive experience with key EU instruments, including the EU ETS, the CBAM, and other EU Green Deal legislations. Time has passed since the EU launched its EU Green Deal in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, at a time of strong demand from the public opinion, but also from the market for sustainability-led policies. There have been some important achievements in the EU Green Deal, including the flagship initiatives such as CSRD on reporting, CSDDD, EU taxonomy, as well as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, that will retain our attention today. But since the last 2024 Parliament elections, the European Union is willing to address what it describes as a new and difficult context. Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine, trade tensions, which accelerated lately, but also different approach taken by other jurisdictions in a period of global regulatory divergence. Overall, the EU is currently questioning the effects of some of its EU Green Deal flagship legislative initiatives to rebuild competitiveness of EU companies. Starting with the Letta and Draghi report in the second half of 2024, member states also addressed the Budapest Declaration to build a new European competitiveness deal and calling to make concrete proposals to reduce administrative burden. In that context, at the end of January 2025, with its competitiveness compass for the European Union, the Commission addressed a communication with far-reaching simplification proposals. It aims to reduce administrative burden by 25% for companies and even 35% for small and medium enterprises. To do that, the Commission has set up an implementation and simplification agenda, which materialized late February with the first Sustainability Omnibus package, a package of proposals to amend some important legislations within which the CBAM regulation. The objective is to simplify and streamline the regulatory framework. Altogether, it's quite a balancing act. because the European Union still wants to achieve its objectives on protecting the environment, but with reducing the burden on economic operators. In that context, and in particular in the current political landscape where tariffs and trade are taking an important role, CBAM plays a specific role, as both seeking to achieve environmental objectives related to carbon emissions, but also somehow constituting a trade defense instrument by seeking a level playing field between goods manufactured in Europe and those that are manufactured outside of the EU. In today's webinar, we will address the changes that are proposed by the Commission to simplify this highly complex mechanism from a regulatory standpoint, and also cover with you some cost management aspect proposed changes of the CBAM mechanism. With that, I will leave the floor to Valerio to cover the proposed recent changes.
Thank you, Thomas. Hello, everybody. Before digging into the new proposed changes of that will be the main topic of this discussion today, just a few words on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, which has been introduced by the regulation 956 of 2023. The main scope is to put a price on emissions that are associated to certain goods that are imported into the EU. And the scope of the CBAM is complementing the EU ETS, which is a mechanism that put a price on goods that are produced in the European Union, and the price is due to the emissions that they are used for producing those goods. And what is the EU trying to prevent is the so-called carbon leakage, meaning that producers of goods within the European territory would decide to move the production outside the EU in states, third country states, where there are more favorable carbon pricing policies, or there are no carbon prices at all, policies at all. And it is important also to clarify that the goods are not under the CBAM regulation, are not all the goods imported in the EU, but there are goods in certain macro areas, the ones that you can see on the slide: cement, electricity, fertilizers, iron and steel, aluminium, and hydrogen. And under these macro areas, the Annex 1 of the regulation, of the CBAM regulation, lists specific products with the specific CN code. So this is the context where we are and what we will discuss today. But as Thomas mentioned, the European Union is currently busy in simplifying some of the measures that have been adopted in the previous mandate under the umbrella of the EU Green Deal, and it has submitted a package of proposals called the Omnibus Package, and within the first Omnibus Package, it has submitted a proposal to simplify the CBAM. The main objective is to help companies to comply with the obligations of the CBAM mechanism, and in this way helping companies to stay competitive, which is one of the main objectives of this mandate of the EU. The proposal at the moment, so it has been submitted by the European Commission in late February, and now it is with the two European co-legislators, the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union, that are working on their individual position, and afterwards they will reach an agreement on a common text. This agreement can be reached in first reading, and we estimate that the adoption could occur in the third quarter of 2025, or in the second reading with an estimated adoption in the fourth quarter of 2025. Those are estimations because we can't have like confirmation on the date, since we don't know how long and difficult the negotiations will be on the text. Also, before going into the details of the new proposal, a reference to the fact that the European Commission will assess extending the CBAM mechanisms to other goods, to final goods, or the so-called downstream products, including steel and aluminium, and will also examine the competitive risk for EU exporters and ways to reduce circumvention risks to the CBAM mechanism. These topics will be embedded in a legislative proposal that should be presented by the European Commission at the end of 2025. But before that, now we will focus on the new changes, on the main changes of the simplification of CBAM. We will not go through all the changes, of course. We selected the ones that we believe are the most relevant, and starting with the minimis threshold that has been introduced, which is the main change of these simplification efforts. So the European Commission is proposing a new de minimis threshold, which is set to 50 tons per year of CBAM goods imported. This is calculated as the annual cumulative mass threshold of imports in the 4 CBAM sector per importer. So these exclude electricity and hydrogen of the sectors that we saw in the previous slide. What is important to stress here is that according to the European Commission, which came up with a methodology that led to the 50 tons per year threshold, the 90% of importers will be exempted from complying with the CBAM rules because they will import less than the threshold. And the CBAM at the same time will continue to cover the 99% of emissions. So those are estimates from the European Commission. What the EU importer will need to do, if it's below the de minimis threshold, will have to self-identify itself as a CBAM occasional importer. But again, there will not be any obligation to comply with the CBAM rules, unless it is, of course, above the threshold. Another important change, just to clarify, before this change, the de minimis threshold was based on an economic value, 150 euros per consignment, which was exposed to circumvention actions, and it was not able to exclude a considerable number of importers. So that is the reason why the EU came up with this new de minimis threshold. Another important modification proposed is the CBAM certificate purchase date, which it is now moved to the February 2027. So this means that at the moment in 2025, we are currently in the transitional period of CBAM. The definitive period will kick in January 2026, and financial obligation will start as of January 2026, meaning that importers will have to buy CBAM certificate to pay for the emissions that are associated with the goods, the CBAM goods that are imported into the EU. The financial obligation remains. What changes here is that the CBAM declarants will have the possibility of purchase the certificate in 2027 and not in 2026. So these have some implications in terms of price fluctuation, and we will see in the next slide what are those implications. I will mention also other changes of these new rules, simplified authorization procedure. In that case, what is relevant is that a CBAM declarant will have the possibility to appoint a CBAM representative that can handle data report and management, even though the CBAM declarant will remain the entity legally responsible for CBAM obligations. And the optional consultation procedure means that the competent authority will have the choice whether to verify or not a CBAM declarant in consultation with other competent authorities. So that's not an obligation, but it will have a choice in that sense. Also, a very important aspect relate to the default values. In terms of default values, the EU importer will have the possibility of choosing whether opt for default values or actual values, and only actual values will be subject to verification. There is also a proposal in the new proposed regulation to amend the way default values are calculated in 2 of the criteria, but this is a bit too technical. Happy to take this offline if with those of you that are interested in this topic. What is important here is that the default values now can be chosen by the EU importer as an option, either actual values of default values, and that's a change compared to the previous system, which could opt for default values in case actual values were not available. Also, another proposed modification is the quarterly CBAM certificate holding requirement that is reduced from 80% to 50%. So this means that an EU importer will need to hold, according to the new proposal, CBAM certificates that amount to the 50% of the emissions associated to goods that are imported since the beginning of the year of importation. So, giving a practical example to simplify, if in the 31st of March 2027, the EU importer will need to have bought CBAM certificates that amount to the 50% of the emissions associated to the goods imported since the beginning of the year. Also, the annual deadline has been moved from the 31st of May to the 31st of August, and this will start in 2027 for the submission of the first CBAM declaration. Also to be mentioned that for certain aspects there has been introduced higher penalties, which can be higher from 3 to 5% higher in case, for example, a non-CBAM declarant, so a subject is not authorized to import goods, is importing goods into the EU, not complying with the CBAM regulation. As I mentioned before, it is interesting the aspect related to the price fluctuation, so the avoidance of the price fluctuation. Simon will go into the details of the CBAM cost management. But I wanted to mention here that moving the deadline for purchasing CBAM certificates also has an impact on the price of the certificate. To clarify, the CBAM certificate is the way the EU importer is paying for the emissions associated to the goods imported, and one CBAM certificate equates to 1 ton of CO2 emissions. And in principle, this is calculated with the weekly average of the EU ETS closing process. So that's the general rule. But the EU is proposing, since it's postponing the obligation to purchase CBAM certificates, to take into account for the year 2026 the EU ETS closing price of the quarter of importation of the goods. Here also a practical example can help. So if the EU importer is importing goods in February 2026, what will be taken into account is the EU ETS closing price of the first quarter of 2026. So this will avoid uncertainty for companies, and that could potentially plan better. And the EU Commission is empowered to adopt implementing acts for giving more clarity on the price calculation methodology for what I just explained. And my last point is also related to how the new proposed regulation is influencing the CBAM certificates, and in this case we are talking about the number of CBAM certificates that EU importers are required to purchase. Two criteria matter in this cost test, especially. The first one is the EU ETS free allocation. I'm not going into the details here because there were no changes in the new proposed rules on this aspect, but there were changes when it comes to the third country carbon credits. So the EU importers have the possibility of purchasing a reduced number of CBAM certificates if a carbon price has been paid in a third country, and that's the first element of novelty, because in the CBAM regulation it states that the carbon price has to be paid in the country of origin, which now is changed in the third country. And in addition, there is also the possibility, according to the proposal, to use default values that are the yearly carbon price set by the third country's rules. And the European Commission is empowered also in this case to adopt implementing acts that to convert the early average carbon price effectively paid, and to help EU importers understanding how the purchase of CBAM of carbon, how the payment of carbon price in a third country can impact the amount of CBAM certificates that need to be purchased. And on this point, I will now leave the floor to Simon to continue the presentation with a case study.
Thank you very much for this insights, Valerio and Thomas, already on the proposed changes, and also welcome from my side to the webinar today. What I will be presenting to you is a bit more details on how you can go about as an importer to estimate the CBAM costs that you might have. For that, I prepared a case study, and we have an in-house carbon pricing model and an in-house CBAM costing model that we use for this case study. As mentioned earlier, we are working on compliance markets as a company and climate neutrality topics, but I will skip on that a bit faster. The agenda from my side today is, first of all, before we really can understand what is our CBAM related cost and can think about how can we manage that cost potentially, we need to calculate the CBAM certificate demand. That's why the agenda and also my further topics will start from estimating the CBAM certificate demand based on a case study to then estimating the CBAM costs and then going towards potential management decisions or potential strategic decisions an importer can take in order to manage those CBAM related costs. And just to clarify, actually all that I am, or most of the things that I'm explaining here seem to only apply to the importing company. However, also exporters are exposed, of course, to those CBAM pricing mechanisms because their products will be more expensive for the importing company. So even for an importing company, or let's say for an exporting company, a producer, it can be very valuable to understand their additional cost markups based on CBAM. And so let's get right into that and start with this estimating of a certificate demand here. So what do we have as a case study? We have a case study of an importer which is importing 80,000 tons of pig iron and 20,000 tons of crude steel. That is our annual import. And this products, they come from an Indian company, Indian Metals Limited and China Steel Co. And from the Indian company, they import pig iron, 50,000 tons, and we have apparently real emission data based on the producer's emission calculation. And we have another importing item, or two importing items. On the one hand, we have the pig iron, and we have the crude steel from a Chinese company, also with emission data that is apparently lower than we currently see in the default values, and that is already one important information here. If of course you choose to use the default values to report emissions going forward from 2026 onwards, your reported emissions will likely be higher than the actual emissions. And that will, of course, make your product more expensive when bringing it into the EU market. Now, with this, having said that, we have this 100,000 tons of import of these different products. Let us now see what our model comes up with in the calculation of that CBAM certificate demand. So basically, with this information of how many tons of import you have, in addition to the emission intensity of that product, so the emission data your suppliers provided you with if you're an importer, along with the information on the CBAM factor, so the phase out of free allowances, and another important point, the CBAM benchmarks. They are not published yet, but they will most likely be published in Q3 and Q4 2025. So we still see a lot of uncertainty in that field. But these CBAM benchmarks, they can already be closely modeled. They can already be taken into account by looking into the benchmarks of the European emission trading system, because the CBAM benchmarks will be based on the benchmarks in the European emission trading system. And so taking all this information together in our model, we then can estimate a certain importer's demand for CBAM certificates. Now, what is shown here is, of course, that for 2026, we already have a demand for CBAM certificates because our model in this iteration, or at least in how I want to present it here, as well as that it takes into account your import year. So the time of where the import happens is the time where you need basically these CBAM certificates, because for these imports, you will at one point have to pay a price. Even though if, as we heard before from Valerio, we will have a postponement of when to buy those CBAM certificates, but still based on your imports of 2026, you will generate a CBAM certificate demand already. Now for this 100,000 tons of pig iron and crude steel that are imported annually, you can see how the demand for CBAM certificates rises from roughly 33,000 euro in 2026, 33,000 CBAM certificates in 2026, up to more than 200,000 CBAM certificates in 2034. There are two cases or two things that play a role here. On the one hand, we assume in our model here in a conservative estimate that from 2030 indirect emissions will be priced as well. And we also assume, of course, that we have this declining CBAM factor. That means a higher and higher share of emissions will be priced because the free allowances in the European emission trading system are reduced. So these 33,000 CBAM certificates that are required show you two things. If I may just compare this, for example, not using this actual data from your suppliers, but using, for example, the default values that currently exist, and that might be the default values also going forward in 2026, so higher values for the emission data, we would already arrive at 50,000 CBAM certificates needed for the import of 100,000 tons of steel. So now with this information, we can make an assessment, a better assessment of what it will be our price for these CBAM certificates. And that is something I want to present to you here. So to estimate the cost of CBAM certificates, we need to understand a bit more of how are those CBAM certificate prices being formed. And the CBAM certificate prices are formed, as you can see, as a average, and this is what Valerio already explained, as an average of the prices in the EU emission trading system on a weekly basis. So you can see we did this example here on the right side for November 2024. In blue, you can see the daily auction prices in the European emission trading system. And in green, you can see then the weekly average of those auction prices, which will basically manifest in the CBAM certificate price of the week afterwards. So we will always have a little bit of a lag of the CBAM certificate price behind the EU ETS price. Then there is one further information that we need, of course, that for imports from 2026 onwards, for each ton of CBAM emissions, one CBAM certificate needs to be surrendered. It needs to be surrendered at the same day where you latest hand in the CBAM declaration. In the new proposal of the EU Commission, this is post to the 31st of August 2027. That would be the first time where you need to submit the CBAM declaration, the declaration for your 2026 imports, and where you would also have to submit then the CBAM certificates for your 2026 imports. The CBAM certificates as such are unlimited in supply. This is just a pricing scheme here. And as mentioned, the price follows the weekly average of the auction prices of the allowances in the EU emission trading system. Number one, let's say, because we have a EU emission trading system 2 coming up as well. For 2026, Valerio already mentioned that we will have quarterly prices. So that means imports that you import during 2026 will be priced with 4 different CBAM certificate prices depending on which quarter you imported them. So this also means that actually from 2027 onwards, from the time where you can purchase CBAM certificates, and that will happen most likely from the 1st of February 27, you will actually have 5 different CBAM certificate prices. 4 CBAM certificate prices for Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, 2026, and then 1 CBAM certificate price for 2027. That is the weekly average. Now, in our example, of course, we cannot look only at what are the EU emission trading prices now. We need to have a longer term view to assess the strategic impact of CBAM on our company. And here you can just see how the prices in the European emission trading system have been changing over time. They have been rising from around €5 2015 to 2018 to 20-30 euro, and then up to above €100 in the past years. Now we are currently again at roughly €60. Also, the whole trade and customs and tariffs environment is bringing prices down again. But the long-term view of how high these prices will be can be assessed through price projections of fundamental models, for example. And they assume that by 2030, we will have somewhere between 110, 120 and 200 euro per ton of CO2. And this needs to be taken into account, of course, when we look at the cost implications. So now let's roll out these kind of cost implications on our CBAM certificate demand. And this is what you can see in this slide. So this is now basically a screenshot from our model outcome, where we have the imported 100,000 tons of pig iron annually. Our assumption here is also that we import these 100,000 tons in basically 4 shipments, each quarter 1 shipment of 25,000 tons, right? Reality is more complex, and of course, if you do a modeling exercise based on your real data, you need to take into account when you really import these goods. Now, with this CBAM certificate demand of 33,120, I see a question in the chat here. Maybe I can already go to that directly. Did the 33,000 certificates mean that we were 33,000 instances where these parts were shipped into Europe? No, that doesn't mean that. It means that based on the imports of your 100,000 tons of products, you have a CBAM certificate demand of 33,120. And these amount of certificates you need to hand in on the 31st of August 2027. Because you can buy CBAM certificates only from the 1st of February of 2027. You basically have the time frame between 1st of February 27 till 31st of August 2027 to buy these 33,000 CBAM certificates for your 26 imports. So again, my representation here assumes that your cost for 2026 imports is levied onto your 2026 budget. In your real liquidity analysis, which we would of course have to do if you do a detailed modeling, your 2026 CBAM costs will of course only appear in 2027, because this is where the CBAM certificates are payable. This kind of liquidity analysis on a quarterly basis, I skipped this for this case study, but it's very relevant, of course, for you to conduct. And you can see that for our importer here, the CBAM certificate costs, even in the early years of the CBAM implementation, are already roughly in the area of a few million euro per year, going up in 2030 to somewhere around 20 billion euro a year. In 2035, we can see a big price uncertainty, of course, because of the big price uncertainty in the European emission trading system. And so we would already have potentially a price of 30 to 40 million euro per year, just because of these additional CBAM certificates costs. Now, of course, you can, and you probably might want to look into a detailed split of which supplier and which product is responsible for these additional costs, so that you can have an internal assessment. First of all, how do I have to change my supplier contracts potentially? And how do I forward these additional costs to my end users again? So a supplier granularity and article granularity of CBAM certificate costs helps you to identify basically cost markups that you need to design in order to make your product again, to basically have the CBAM costs being put further downstream and not covering it yourself internally at all. And you might also want to maybe just have a possibility to negotiate with your suppliers or with your end users for the good and how you can basically distribute the costs of CBAM. Now, with this information here on the estimated cost of CBAM certificates, we can go to the next topic, and the next topic is how to manage now these costs of CBAM. Of course, we first need to understand that we have to look at what I've been showing you right now, not only on an annual basis, but on a quarterly basis, because there is this rule in the CBAM regulation that per quarter you need to have, and this is the updated rule now. Valerio already explained. The expectation is that in Q3, Q4 25, we will finally have a final legislative text here, but that the importer of a CBAM good needs to have 50% of that amount of CBAM certificates that they need already on their account in the CBAM registry per quarter, right? So you need to have a quarterly analysis to understand the liquidity requirement and how to make available this amount of liquidity. So to manage this cost of CBAM, we need to understand a few more things. You can see here that we took as an example year, the year 2023, and calculated the CBAM certificate price. That is the black line you can see in this graph on the left side. It is a weekly average price, always based on the EU emission trading price. And you can see that depending on when you would, of course, purchase such a CBAM certificate, the price is very different. Now I compare in this example two strategies of CBAM certificate procurement. One strategy is to buy the CBAM certificates whenever you are required by the regulation. That's the regulation-based approach. So always at the end of the quarter, you buy the entire amount of CBAM certificates that you need to buy based on this 50 or 80% rule, right? End of the quarter one, purchase end of the quarter two, purchase end of quarter three, purchase end of quarter four. Then next to that, we look at a strategy that we designed that at Carbonary. It's called a moving average smart strategy, where you devise some technical chart analysis for the European emission trading systems prices and identify bottoming out of those EU emission allowance prices. Because when the EU emission allowance prices are low, the CBAM certificates prices in the next week will be low. So we can find a better strategy on making these procurement decisions on CBAM certificates. And this is the blue bar here, and you can see this strategy performed for 2023 actually quite well. We found the bottom, and it's not that I placed this bar here, it's just basically the statistical analysis of where we would have bought with this strategy. So that means we can use the short-term EU ETS prices for CBAM price forecasts, and with that, we were able, for example, for 2023, to have a 5% cost reduction. Even for 2024, which was a different year, we also had a roughly 1% cost reduction. We did this analysis for all EU ETS prices from 2013 until 2024, and the average reduction during this entire time period by using a smarter strategy than regulation-based is actually 10 to 15%. So such a procurement strategies for CBAM certificates, of course, must outperform statistically against a regulation-based approach. And the important point is here, of course, that if you can reduce your costs by that, it just helps your product to be more competitive. And a 5 or 10% cost reduction is not to scoff at. It is quite substantial in that environment. Now, of course, you also need to, or you can look into one more point of managing these costs of CBAM, and they are right now not really related to when you purchase your CBAM certificate, but they took a bit of a longer term view. And the longer term view is that price certainty is very valuable. for an importer and also for your supply contracts and so on. And as we heard before, the European emission trading systems prices are reflected in the CBAM certificate prices. This means if you want to secure a price for your CBAM certificates already now, you can do so by hedging in the European emission trading system. This can be done by buying those EUAs. These are the European emission allowances, the allowances in the European emission trading system. You buy them in 2025, and then you can sell them at the time where you buy your CBAM certificate, because then this price difference is taken care of, right? You can lock in a CBAM certificate price basically already today through such a proxy hedge in the European emission trading system. And this can also be achieved via future products or derivative market products. And in that case, you can, on the one hand, fix a certain price for your CBAM certificates, not only for the next year, but also for 27, 28, 29, which might help you a lot in having this price certainty. Of course, it also means liquidity requirement. This is something you just need to be aware of. Of course, it's always also a game about liquidity. How much money do you have available to already buy CBAM certificates early or buy EU emission allowances early? But this is just one idea of how you can also manage your exposure to CBAM. And this is especially true for the producers as well, because a producer of a CBAM good located in Turkey, located in China and India, a big steel mill, they could purchase emission allowances in the emission trading system, and then they can offer their EU clients a product with a fixed CBAM cost, right? So this goes both ways, both for the importer as well as for the exporter. This could be a viable strategy. Now, to summarize a bit from my side, what is needed to manage now these CBAM costs? Well, your procurement strategy or your liquidity analysis, all of this, of course, needs to take into account your own company-specific liquidity constraints. How do you package those CBAM costs and put them onto your downstream users? You need, of course, try to find a CBAM procurement strategy that outperforms statistically against another one. It needs to align with your own risk management as a company and your own strategy on that. So in most cases, especially if larger volumes of imports are targeted, this needs to be anchored as well somewhere in the finance and strategy department. And you can, of course, also consider how much of these potential extra CBAM costs you can pass on to your end clients, and how can you pass this on? What is your contractual relationship here? Well, other points is of course that these procurement strategies, hedging strategies, can be in the form of a back-to-back strategy. You buy these certificates whenever you import, but this doesn't mean you reach a good price, or you just buy them at a certain time when you feel there is enough that you import it right now. It can be event-based, so depending on whenever you import or whenever your client takes this good further on, so you can pass on the CBAM costs to them. So there are different ways on how to manage those costs. And this is it from my side. I hope this was insightful to you to understand a bit what are the relationships here from different sides, from both the emissions that your producers and the clients, your suppliers, provide to you, towards the CBAM certificate demand, towards the CBAM cost demand, and then the managing of those costs. And I think now I hand back to Valerio.
Yes, I see. Thank you, Simon. I see that there are some questions. Maybe you can have a look at the questions, and I finished with the action points for companies, and then you can get back to those. I see that they are pretty long, so you can have some time to reflect on those. And in the meantime, I wanted to conclude with some action points for companies. This relates mainly to the proposed changes that we presented before of the CBAM simplification effort. And first of all, we divide in small importers and other importers. So small importers, meaning that you importers that will not import more than 50 tons per year of CBAM goods, meaning that they are not obligated to comply with the CBAM regulation if the proposed regulation would be adopted. So in this case, our suggestion is to monitor the legislative process and confirm that this potential CBAM exemption will be confirmed, because that, again, this is a proposal so far, so this is not intended. Also, our message is not that this is the new rule, because the rule needs to be adopted. So you should monitor as a small importer if this will be the case. Also evaluate whether registration as a CBAM declarant it is needed. So that's an important point. As of the end of March 2025, it is possible to submit the request to be registered as a CBAM declarant, which is mandatory for importing goods, CBAM goods into the EU. And it is a process that takes also some time, around 120 days for the verification. But in any case, a small importer should really evaluate whether it will exceed or not the threshold. And in case there is a doubt, or in case it is probably exceeding it, register as a CBAM declarant in order to be compliant with the CBAM rules when especially as of 2026, when the financial obligations will kick in. And then as a third point, assess also whether it is necessary to self-identify as an occasional importer. This is something that is stated by the Commission in the working document that was published together with the proposed regulation. So that's also another consideration to be made by the occasional small importers. To be seen how this will be concretely possible, like this self-identification. That's another topic to be monitored. And on the other side, for the other importers of CBAM goods, so the ones that they are exceeding the 50 tons per year, similarly, they will have to monitor the legislative process to understand, first of all, if those rules will be confirmed, and also starting understanding what are the new requirements. Also, I mentioned, for example, on penalties, but there are other requirements on carbon technology, carbon accounting for default values that also need to be taken into account, and so on. So starting familiarize with the new proposed rules, and also the impact that these changes will have on your business. And this to prepare for full compliance with the CBAM application from 2026, including the payment obligation, as we discussed. The payment obligations, the purchase and surrender of CBAM certificates will be as of February 2027, with surrender in August 2027. But anyways, financial obligation already kick in 2026, so companies will need to prepare, and Simon explained this very well, how this estimation can be done. And in general, pay attention, as I mentioned before, also at the penalty mechanisms. Also, small and other importers, in this case, I assume more the importers that will fall under the CBAM regulation may consider to engage and provide input in the legislative process, considering that at the moment the proposal is being discussed by the EU co-legislators, and that's a moment where there is a possibility to engage and to provide input in the legislative process. For estimating compliance, for understanding the rules, and also for engaging in the legislative process, we of course are ready to help companies that want to be assisted in these procedures. And on this note, I opened. I don't know, Thomas, you have some final remarks? So
Yes, thank you, Valerio. Thank you, Simon. I think it was a lot of great insights in this complex mechanism. At a time of potential changes, we heard how companies can prepare for the existing mechanisms that is here to stay, although possibly amended in terms of scope and in terms of details. There is a clear willingness of EU institutions in seeking simplification, streamlining obligations, but still the overall objective and the mechanism is here to remain. And it's great to read those insights coming from Carbonir about how you can still prepare for forthcoming obligations. In the meantime, I think, Valerio, you summarized very well the current situation and what companies should do in what is a reopened political momentum. Companies now need to both continue working on their compliance while keeping an eye on the political agenda and see how things develop, and ensure that things develop in a manner which is favorable to their interest through their individual representation, through industry and associations. The next months will be busy when it comes to CBAM, as it will be for other ESG legislations. We have a few questions in the Q&A. The first one, I think, addressed to Simon from Glenda. How can we calculate the CBAM certificate demand? And will the moving average smart strategy be a tool that will be available by the EU ETS or Carboneer?
Well, the second one first, it's a tool that we developed. It's basically a certain kind of methodology at looking when are prices high and low for CBAM certificates. So feel free to reach out if you want to learn more on how this works. The other point on how can be calculated the CBAM certificate demand, there is a formula that can be used for that. And again, you need to take into account roughly 3 or 4 different parameters in that formula. You can find it in the Q&A of the EU CBAM from the EU Commission. There is a little example also on how this is done, and it basically takes into account, as I said, the emissions that you import, the CBAM benchmarks, the CBAM factor, and the EU ETS price, and these are combined into how to calculate your CBAM certificate demand and then your CBAM relevant price.
Thank you very much. The next question, I think you can both address it from a regulatory and a cost management standpoint. The question from Jonathan is as follows. If there is a carbon tax in the exporting country already in place and the exporting company has, let's say, paid 5% carbon tax already on the pig iron in the origin country, and then the product is being imported by the European company, in which way will the pig iron still be affected by the CBAM regulations? So the question relates on how to compensate for a carbon price paid already in third countries. Maybe Valerio, if you want to cover that before Simon jump in with a more technical aspect of the question.
Yeah, this was briefly touched upon before in the presentation. So there is now the possibility. So how does it affect the carbon, the number of CBAM certificates? That's where it goes. In the meaning that if you paid already a carbon price for a specific CBAM good that then is imported into the EU, this price that you paid under certain condition can have an impact on the number of CBAM certificates that you need to purchase in the EU, meaning that you will pay less for the emissions because you will have to buy less CBAM certificates. What is the change now? It is that before, what you could take into account, it was only the carbon price that you paid in the country of origin, while now it can be taken into account also the carbon price paid in a third country. Could be also a different country than the country of origin. And also another interesting aspect is that according to the CBAM regulation, it is the actual value to be taken into account, while now also the default values can be taken into account. But again, if the proposed rules will be adopted. But yes, there is an impact of the carbon price paid in a third country and in the country of origin.
And I think it's a very important topic and a topic which is gaining importance in the current situation on how to have somehow some coordination and some convergence on the various mechanisms that exist or that are in the course of being adopted worldwide to ensure that the EU, if it is achieving its objectives, need to take into consideration other jurisdictions which are also pursuing the same objective when it comes to carbon emission. Maybe Simon, if you want to complement Valerio's answer on the more technical aspect on how to take that into consideration in the mechanism you described.
Yeah, my example was specifically without taking into account any third carbon price paid, because it would make everything much more complex and not so easy to explain. The first point is you mentioned here, let's say a 5% carbon tax. The CBAM regulation is specific and it says carbon price effectively paid. So you need to really find out through the entire supply chain of that product how many euros then basically calculated according to certain currency exchange rates, but again, a detailed topic, how much euro per ton of produced product has been paid as a CO2 price in the entire supply chain. If you cannot provide this information, the EU Commission provides a default value for the carbon price paid in a third country, which will most likely not be including many countries, to be frank, because not many countries have a carbon pricing scheme that is equivalent to the EU ETS. And if then, let's say, you would have paid 50 euro per ton of product, or 50 euro per ton of CO2 that was emitted during the production of the pig iron, if that has been paid already by the producer of the pig iron, and you are just the importer of the pig iron, you can deduct these 50 euro from your price tag that is basically levied onto you as an importer. In the end, this will mean it will reduce the amount of CBAM certificates that you need to purchase. This is how this calculation will work. So basically, you can use, or basically the price that has been paid abroad can be deducted from the price that an importer has to pay, but only under the conditions that either you can provide proof on all these payments, or that you use a default value that the EU Commission provides. I hope that also clarified that a bit.
Also,
thank you very much. Another question which is related to important concepts, other important concepts, which are default values and benchmark. Could you explain maybe in some more details what those concepts relate to? And I will have a question for you is, wouldn't relying on default values be a quite efficient manner to address this very complex mechanism? And my reading so far is that default values are somehow used as a punitive mechanism, but wouldn't it make the life of everyone simpler if default values was a rule, and then where companies could modify or take a different approach under specific justification?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as Valerio also showed, now it is not a need anymore to use actual emission values, but you can always use a default value. And I think this is the first understanding also from the EU Commission side, that there is no way to get the real data on such a granularity that is very, very tricky with the complex supply chains we have worldwide. I think this is an understanding that we see reflected in default values are more common. And if you as an importer have better data, that means more efficient producers, you can provide proof, and then you have still a benefit, right? And this is, I think, what we will see, and what we see as well with the default value for the CO2 pricing. I don't know if you, Valerio, want to explain that default value and benchmark systematic. I think it cannot be fit in the last 2 minutes, but it's a bit more complex, but I'll give you maybe still the word.
I mean, as you said, maybe 2 minutes is not enough, but I can say something on default values on third country that it was not mentioned, because in the new rules, proposed rules, it is proposed also a different calculation for the default values for the carbon price paid in a third country, which would be based on the 10 worst emitting countries. So that's an element of novelty compared to the current regulation. On the question of the benchmark, so the ETS benchmark comes into play for another type of factor that needs to be considered for the CBAM, for the number of CBAM certificates that the EU importers need to buy, which is the EU ETS free allocation quota. And what we can say now is that ETS benchmark and play a very important role in calculating the amount of the CBAM certificates. But for more information, we can take this offline, because in 60 seconds that would be very, very complicated. But the difference is that default values are values that can be used if actual data is not available. So if actual data is not available, the EU importer can rely on default value to understand the number of CBAM certificates to be bought, while the benchmark, the ETS benchmark, is used in a different context to understand the number of CBAM certificates to be bought, but for in relation to the EU ETS free quota.
No, thank you, Valerio. I certainly share the comments that are being made on the fact that using default values could become a cheap option, and could be an interesting avenue to explore, like in the current political momentum. to really effectively simplify the mechanism. With that, we are coming to the end of this webinar. I would like to thank our both experts very much for their very useful insights. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Valerio. I think it was a very useful. It's an important topic, a topic that will evolve in the coming months, and we will keep you all updated in this omnibus legislation package development. So keep in touch. And with that, have a nice afternoon and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.